It's always nice getting that little glimpse into the early church. Silas, who possibly helped Peter write the letter, speaking better Greek than the Galilean fisherman, or possibly just took the letter to various recipients. And the church in Babylon, which was code for Rome, the big enemy of people of God, sends their greetings to all the recipients, which I guess would have to include us then. Not that I think Peter could possibly have imagined that at the time of writing. So this final section of the letter is really just a continuation of last week, which ended, commit yourselves to God and continue to do good. So this is more of an elaboration on that. And I should maybe have asked somebody else to preach today, because he starts by addressing church leaders. Anyway, here I am. And you may notice that the New Testament uses 3 different titles for church leaders. You have elders, you have shepherds, and you have overseers. And actually all 3 of them feature in this passage. First, the term elders is fairly obviously there. And that comes actually from the life of the Jewish synagogue, because the first Christians, when they started gathering, for one thing, they were all Jews, and they just copied the way that the synagogue meetings proceeded and added Jesus. And then, of course, as it spread amongst the Gentiles, it kind of metamorphosed and changed and ended up like this. Here we are. And originally, as is still obvious from the English word, an elder was simply an older person, because back then old age was respected, not like nowadays. We have the youngest addressing all of you here. But back then, age was respected. In the Middle East, age is still respected because of experience and because of, well, assumedly more knowledge. So it was natural. The older people would be seen as the leaders. But then we have the shepherds. That is actually where the word pastor comes from, because pastor simply means shepherd in Latin. And in most Latin-derived languages, the term for my role here and the term for people out there moving the sheep around is actually still the same. Whereas we've confused it a bit by using the Latin term for the church pastor. This term is also used in Hebrew in the Old Testament about the leaders of Israel. And there is a famous prophecy in Ezekiel where God denounces the faithless shepherds of Israel and promises that he himself, the Lord himself, would take over leadership and be the shepherd of Israel. And as you can already see where my thoughts are going, that is obviously fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus calls himself the good shepherd. Peter calls him in this passage the chief shepherd. And in Hebrews 13, the author calls Jesus the great shepherd. So it's very much the case that Jesus is the arch shepherd, if you like, the chief pastor of the flock. But then you may remember from the end of the Gospel of John, Jesus sort of passes that calling on to who? To Peter. Feed my sheep. It says in 3 different versions. Shepherd my sheep is actually what he says in Greek in one of them. The NIV translates it as take care of, because we don't normally use shepherd as a verb. Greek does. Shepherd my sheep. And that is exactly what Peter is saying in this passage to the local church leaders. Shepherd the flock of God. So he's passing on this role that Jesus had given to him. He passes that on to the local church leaders to have exactly that same function, to be the shepherds of the flock. The third title I mentioned is the word overseer. Now you can read through that passage on your sheet any number of times. You will not find the word overseer in there, so don't waste your time looking for it. But in verse 2, the NIV translates it as watching over them, as a task that is entrusted to the shepherds. That is the word to exercise oversight, which is episkopeo in Greek, which is where we get the word bishop from. A bishop is an overseer. That's how it started. And originally, it was just another title for the local church leader. All these 3 titles, elder, shepherd, and overseer, referred to the same group of people in the early church, the leaders of the local congregation. They were called to be shepherds. They were called to use their life experience and wisdom to lead the congregation and to watch over the flock in various ways. It means leading the church in worship, guiding the church in making wise decisions, teaching the truth and refuting falsehood, because that has always been an issue. You had false teachers, false doctrines going around. A main role of these elders and shepherds was to make sure that the sheep weren't led astray by false teaching. And of course, as Peter is doing in this letter as well, encouraging the believers to stand firm in their faith and in their discipleship. That was a very important role of the shepherd overseer, if you like. And as far as we know, virtually all local churches to begin with had a plural eldership. They had several shepherds, elders, overseers, whatever you want to call them. And it was only kind of gradually over time that, for one thing, the elders and the bishops were separated out into different offices, and local churches ended up having just one main leader, who we now call the pastor. And it probably came about something like this. Certain people were given more training in understanding the Bible, knowing theology, learning doctrine, that sort of thing. They were obviously given responsibility to teach the church, make sure that you didn't have false teaching come in. And eventually they became the main leader and eventually the only leader. There were other factors involved as well, but that is probably one important reason why we ended up with a kind of one person called the pastor shepherd. And it makes sense. I mean, I have been to Bible college. I do read a lot of theology. I do understand the doctrine. Well, not exhaustively, obviously, but probably more than most of you have had time or inclination to look into. So in a way, it makes sense that people with that sort of training do most of the teaching and preaching in church. But when it comes to other aspects of church life, like pastoral care, for example, I don't think it's reasonable that one person should have sole responsibility in that area. It doesn't really make sense. If you read through the notes from the discernment process, you'll notice that somebody had commented that not everybody finds me easy to approach with problems. I don't find that particularly surprising, because if it was the other way around, if I have problems, there are certain colleagues of mine that I would happily approach. There are other colleagues of mine that I probably wouldn't, because we're all different. We can't all click with the same people. So I'm going to say, just because you don't feel that I'm the most similar to you, or the one who is most likely to understand your particular situation, don't let that put you off getting the support and comfort and help that you do need. All the leaders of the church are available for pastoral care. But all the deacons, and if you don't know who the deacons are, well, you can all see each other. Deacons, please wave. All the deacons are available. The Bible study group leaders are available. Or you could just go to another mature Christian that you trust. It doesn't have to be a church leader. We're all called to support and help and advise each other. It doesn't have to be the full-time pastor. Obviously, you are always welcome to come to me, or you can go to Annette. If you think she would understand you better, she probably would. But don't be put off getting pastoral care and advice just because you don't find me the most approachable. Look at Peter in this passage. Does he say, I, Peter, the great apostle? Well, no, he doesn't. Does he call himself Peter the Pope? No, he doesn't. I mean, that title didn't even exist when Peter wrote this letter. And the word Pope actually just means father. Anyway, every spiritually mature teacher was a father to their flock anyway. So that came later, the whole idea of having a super shepherd called the Pope. But Peter just calls himself your fellow elder. He was an apostle. He had seen Jesus in the flesh. Jesus had given him this particular command, feed my sheep. Jesus said, on this rock, I will build my church. And he still just speaks as your fellow elder. He doesn't use his authority, his position. And he probably does that to illustrate this main thing that he actually talks the most about in this passage, and that's humility, which he learned from Jesus. You can trace a lot of Jesus in Peter's epistles, actually. You can tell that he heard him in person and spent a lot of time with him. Because Jesus says, the greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. That's in Matthew 23. Peter spells it out very clearly. The correct motivation for leadership, not the main motivation for leadership, the only correct motivation for leadership should be the servant heart, like Jesus had. It's not the academic qualification that matters. It's not your personal achievement, how many books you've written, or how many languages you've learned, or how many years you've been a Christian. The only thing that matters is your servant heart, a genuine desire to serve God and to serve his people. That is what qualifies you as a church leader. And in case it's not absolutely clear, Peter spells it out. Leaders must not be motivated by personal gain, what they can get out of it. We usually think of money when we think of that. And sadly, it's not difficult to think of very public leaders and preachers, especially on American television, that are very obviously in it for the money, for their personal gain. And it's a shame that they are given a platform and are given airtime when it's so obvious that they're not in it to serve God and serve his congregation. But there we are. At least that's fairly obvious to spot. There are other more subtle snares for people who want to be in a leadership position, like the craving for fame, wanting to be recognized, wanting to have your name in print, wanting to have power. Some people are desperate to just be able to tell people what to do and make them do it. Or, even more subtle, the need to be needed. I need to be a leader because I need people to feel dependent on me. All those things, whichever one you have, kind of the money or the needing to be needed or the power or whatever, none of that should play any part in the motivation for a church leader. I mean, some leaders and some preachers do become famous. I guess can't be helped. And if God is working mightily through them, like Billy Graham or John Stott, it's not wrong that they become famous in that way. And I think the best famous preachers were also very humble. I think that was true of John Stott. I think that was true of Billy Graham. But the only correct motivation should be wanting to serve God, whether you become famous or not. Then Peter, just to make sure, he points out that this humility is obviously for everyone. Younger believers, immature believers should, of course, humbly submit to the elders, the leaders. But maybe he felt it was particularly important to point out that church leaders were also kind of included in this call for humility to be Christ-like. And it's worth remembering, actually, that in antiquity, humility was not a characteristic that was sort of generally approved of. Humility, or humbleness, if you like, that was a slave attitude. A free man, a free woman had no reason to be humble. That wasn't something that the philosophers and the speakers of that time, the pagans, would have encouraged. It's a uniquely biblical position to elevate humility as a godly characteristic, which is maybe why it's so important to look at Jesus, who is the extreme example of that kind of humility. That is a stumbling block, or was a stumbling block to the Gentiles, that somebody would make humility a positive thing. So Peter wants to emphasize it. He quotes a passage from the Old Testament, Proverbs 3. I've said before, Peter is full of the Old Testament. He keeps quoting and referring to it. Followers of Jesus, he says, should humble themselves under the mighty hand of God. That, by the way, mighty hand of God, is another Old Testament allusion. What does humbling yourself before God mean? Well, it means confessing your sin and repenting of your sin. That's an obvious answer. Not thinking higher of yourself than you should. Paul spells that out in one of his epistles. Serving without thought of personal gain or recognition or recompense. And of course, something Peter has talked a lot about, accepting suffering for the sake of Jesus. All those things fit under humbling yourself under God's hand. And then you get to verse 7, which is often used, kind of sort of taken out of context in a way, as a verse of encouragement. Cast all your anxiety on God because he cares for you. It's a great verse. And you may know that Paul says something very similar in Philippians. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Peter is a little bit more forceful here. Maybe that goes with somebody who was called the Rock, because he says, throw your anxieties on God. Not just kind of present them like Paul does politely. Throw all your anxieties on God because he cares for you. Peter had heard quite a lot of Jesus' teaching about how God cares for you. And he would probably have remembered this passage from Matthew 10. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. It's one of those great passages to talk about how God cares for us. He knows us personally. We don't have to worry. But did you notice something? Did you notice those sparrows? They still fall to the ground. It doesn't say that he preserves them. He knows all about them. He knows every single one of them. But they still fall to the ground. They are still sold for a penny, or whatever what today's equivalent would be. Casting your anxieties on God doesn't mean that everything will go away and everything will be fine and hanky-dory and you will not have any problems anymore. That isn't what Jesus is promising. There will still be suffering. There are still people who want to kill our bodies, as people in Afghanistan are experiencing to a very high degree right now. So life will not be perfect just because you cast all your anxieties on God. And that, of course, is because we have an enemy, the arch enemy, who Peter then goes on to talk about, Satan. We need to be aware of that. Some modern churches sort of act as if the devil was really just a sort of medieval fairy tale, and we hold on to God, but we drop the devil. That doesn't work, because if there was only good and no evil, the world would not look the way it looks today. The fact that the world looks the way it does, is evidence that there is an evil power. And the Bible spells it out very clearly. Satan is our enemy, and his sole purpose in life is to destroy the church of God. That is what he's out to do, to destroy Christians and to destroy the church of Jesus that proclaims God's victory over evil. So he prowls around, says Peter, like a ferocious lion, looking for someone to devour, which again is probably another Old Testament allusion. In Psalm 22, we read about the enemies of the crucified Savior. They are described as roaring lions that tear their prey. And Peter is probably referring to that, the same powers, earthly and spiritual, that were against Jesus, are now against us, just as ferocious as they were then. They want to devour us. They want to make us give up, stop following Jesus, deny our faith, choose the path of least resistance, choose comfort over sacrifice. In Peter's epistle here, the main tool, if you like, that Satan might be using is persecution, which is quite common around the world. But the devil will happily use the opposite, comfort and convenience, or disease, or temptation to sinful pleasure, or anything, respect from your peers. He will use anything that will make us doubt the goodness of God, anything that will kind of take us away from Jesus, anything that will make us put Jesus sort of on the back burner. It doesn't matter if it's persecution or kind of well-being or whatever we have. But it might be worth pointing out, Satan's main aim is not to kill us. Because if we die while we're following Jesus, if we're martyred for the sake of Jesus, well, that's a victory for Jesus. That's a defeat for Satan. And that features in C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters, where you have the senior tempter teaching a junior tempter how to tempt Christians. And at one point, because this is set during World War II, the senior tempter points out that currently your victim is very aware of his mortality, is very aware of needing God. If he dies now, he will be lost to us. So your aim is to keep him alive. Keep him alive into old age, when he will start maybe sliding away from faith. If he dies when he knows he can die, he will be prepared to die, and then he will be lost to hell, be gained for Jesus. So Satan's aim isn't necessarily to kill us. He will use the fear of death. He will happily use the fear of death to scare us into sin of doubt, but he will not want to kill us while we are followers of Jesus. So we need to resist him. James says the same thing in his epistle. Resist the devil and he must flee, says James. How do we resist the devil? Well, basically by humbling ourselves under God. Peter has already given that answer. Humble yourselves, resist the devil. So how to resist the devil? By humbling ourselves, by confessing our sin, by resisting temptation, serving selflessly and willingly, i.e. resisting selfishness, because self-centeredness is a very satanic attitude. Satan is the most self-centered being you can imagine. So rejecting selfishness is a very good way of resisting the devil. Accepting suffering rather than griping about your rights and your unmet expectations is another good way of resisting the devil. Cast your anxieties on God. That is how you resist the devil. And he will give strength to stand firm, so you don't give in to temptation and don't give in to external pressure of whatever kind. Other believers are facing much worse than us. They can be an encouragement for us when we see how they stand firm. And also, let's not forget what waits at the end. Glory. The word glory features 3 times in this passage. Did you notice that? And also in a couple of the songs we sang. The beauty of the presence of God. That's what awaits us at the end. Light, joy, freedom from sin, freedom from disease. It's quite an amazing thing, really, that God has called us into his glory to share this wonderful existence with him. He's called us to live eternally in his presence. I mean, it can't get better than that. So if we respond to that call, if we hold on to our confession, then, as Peter says, when the chief shepherd appears, when Jesus comes back, again, something we sing a lot about, wait for. When Jesus comes back, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. Because earthly glory does fade away. Even the most illustrious preacher will one day be out of date and forgotten. Even with the internet, even though it's easier to kind of remain on the internet than it used to be, one day our fame will be gone, however famous we get. But this crown of glory that we receive simply because we commit our lives to Jesus and submit to God, that will never fade away. That is an eternal glory. So we mustn't allow anything to distract us from following Jesus. We mustn't allow anything to make us succumb to Satan's temptation. We have to resist the devil, stand firm, humbling ourselves under God. And I was going to say, let's take a few moments in prayer right now to do just that. Some moments of silent prayer where you can think about, is there a particular sin you need to confess in order to resist better? Is there a particular sinful, selfish attitude you need to confess to resist better? Let's take a few moments in silent prayer before God.